Here is what happened to Michael Rockefeller. Jim, one of the elders, noticed something making its way into the river from the sea. It was this white thing kind of slithering towards them, and immediately Jim called out to the others to look, there's something over there. It's a white crocodile, it's a serpent, it's something. And so, not wanting to be caught off guard, the entire group got ready and began paddling over to see what this thing was, because if it was a threat, they could deal with it. If it wasn't, so be it. And so as these 8 canoes converged on this white thing, some of them had their spears up ready to attack, but when they finally saw what this creature was, they realized it was not some serpent or crocodile or something. It was a white man. And he's seeing the tribe that he had come to see in the first place. They've come here to rescue him. And so, practically crying with relief, he turned around and grabbed one of their canoes. And as soon as he did, one of the elders, Pep, looked down at Michael holding onto his boat. And then Pep looked up at the other 2 elders, Finn and Jim, and they just stared at each other, then back at Michael, then back at each other, and then they nodded in agreement. And then Pep helped Michael into the boat. Michael immediately just laid in the middle of the boat. He was so exhausted from that swim, but he was so relieved, and he just laid there while the tribe kind of got back into position. They turned their canoes around and began paddling back up the river, back inland. And as they paddled, they began this very strange chant. All 8 canoes, all 50 plus members of the tribe, all in unison began this chant. And Michael, he had studied the Asmat tribe and felt like he knew a lot about their culture, but he had never heard this particular chant before. And so he was enchanted by it, and he tried to ask them, what does this mean? But they just completely ignored Michael and just continued to paddle and chant. And so Michael just laid there listening, getting carried along to safety, when all of a sudden the chanting stopped and the canoes turned and kind of made their way into this little inlet that led to a clearing right on the shore. And so Michael noticed they were slowing down, and so he kind of barely got up and looked over the edge of the canoe to see if they were at their village. But when he looked up, he saw there was no village in sight. It was just this clearing out on the shore. And right away, Michael's like, well, I hope we're going to the village soon, because I have to find someone who can get in touch with the authorities, who can then go and rescue Renee and hopefully find Simon and Leo as well. And so Michael began trying to ask the men in his canoe if they would help him, but there was, of course, a massive language barrier, and neither side really understood the other. And then at some point, one of the men from the Asmat tribe just began laughing at Michael. And when he did, the majority of the rest of the tribe looked over, saw what was going on, and they too began laughing at Michael. And so Michael had no idea what was going on. And then before he could do anything else, the entire tribe stopped laughing, and it was like in an instant, they were back into that rhythmic chanting as they slowly began making their way out of their canoes, making their way onto shore. And so Michael began to sense that something was wrong, and instead of getting out of the canoe with the rest of the tribe, he kind of instinctively laid back down on the canoe, almost like he was trying to get away from them. And when he did that, the tribesman who had first laughed at Michael, he stood right over Michael as he's doing this chant, and he smiled at Michael, and then he raised his spear and he drove it into Michael's side. And the second he did that, other members of the tribe raised these horns they were carrying and began blasting into their horns. And so Michael, he's screaming out in pain, but he's got no strength to defend himself. And so he kind of like rolled over onto the other side on this canoe, kind of trying to protect himself. And when he did that, the guy just lifted his spear again with a big smile on his face and drove it into Michael's other side. After the man pulled the spear out, Michael, who's in horrible pain, managed, perhaps with his adrenaline, to pull himself up and over the side of the canoe. So he kind of fell out onto the mud, and he tried to stand up to get away from them, but there was nowhere he could go. And so as he's kind of fumbling in the mud, 2 of the tribesmen walked up behind him, grabbed him under the arms, and they began carrying him across the clearing towards the jungle. And as they walked, that rhythmic chanting continued, and periodically Michael would hear someone blast on their horn. And so Michael was dragged across the shoreline into the jungle, and then finally to another clearing in the jungle, not anywhere near their village. And Michael was positioned in the middle of this clearing and put on his knees. And so Michael, he's kind of guarding his sides with his arms. He's incredibly weak. He's on his knees. The tribe kind of formed a circle around him, and they're continuing this chant. And then at some point, one of the tribesmen walked up to Michael, grabbed his head and pushed it forward, exposing the back of his neck. And then another tribe member walked in, and again, the whole time, this chanting is going on, horns are being blown, and this other tribesman comes up and he raises an axe and he brings it down on the back of Michael's neck. It would turn out the Asmat tribe knew who Michael was. They remembered him from his visit several months earlier when he had attempted to barter for their bis poles, and they had been totally offended that this rich white man had shown up and thought he could just buy one of their sacred artifacts like it was some trinket to be put on display in a museum. And so they had held on to a deep hatred for him. That was why they didn't send their bis pole to him. They weren't going to give it to him. But when Michael had kind of magically floated into their river, and suddenly the Asmat tribe has him sitting in their canoe, the three village elders, Finn, Ajim, and Pep, they all just kind of looked at each other and nodded in agreement that they were going to ritualistically kill Michael to avenge the deaths of many of their fallen warriors that those bis poles apparently contained the souls of, because many of their warriors had been killed by white men in the past, and so Michael was going to be their way to avenge their souls. And so that chant that Michael heard them all saying, that was the chant they did when they performed this execution ritual. Except they didn't just kill Michael. After one of those tribesmen brought the axe down on the back of Michael's neck, another tribesman walked up and grabbed Michael's hair, pulled his head back, and used a knife to slash at his throat to actually remove his head. And then after his head was removed, again with all the chanting continuing in this circle the whole time, members of the tribe came up and began cutting Michael's body absolutely to pieces, separating his organs and his flesh and his bones into different piles, and then very quickly they got a fire going and cooked and ate Michael. And of all the parts of his body that were eaten, his brain was apparently the most important, and so only Finn, Ajim, and Pep, the three elders, were allowed to eat the brain. And then finally, after they had finished eating and took all the remaining meat that had not been consumed, and they put it into their pouches to eat later, Finn, one of the elders, took Michael's skull, and he would bring it back to the village, and he would cover it in banana leaves, and he would paint it, and treat it like a trophy. A few days later, when that huge search party came through the area looking for Michael, the Asmat tribe knew they could never whisper a word about what happened to Michael, because if it got out, it's very likely that Westerners would want to retaliate against them. And so for decades and decades, their secret stayed safe until Carl Hoffman of the National Geographic heard the story and then wrote the book about it, Savage Harvest. But despite publishing this book and lots of people reading it, there was always some question about the credibility of the story, because remember, there's all this intrigue and mystery around Michael's story to begin with, and now we have this account coming from the Asmat tribe, and so no one really knew how legitimate it was. And so to this day, the Rockefeller family, and generally speaking, authorities at large, still say that Michael Rockefeller drowned on his swim to shore trying to get help, and that's it.